My name is Tony Sinholm, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's session of our CMC Connect series. Just for a quick background of myself, I graduated CMC in 2017 with a science and management major in the biotech sequence, as well as a dual major in film studies. So I like to say one major made me fun and the other major made me employable in a lot of corporate America. But for those who knew me as a student, they would frequently see me working at admissions or information technology. I'll also be involved in a few of our clubs in outdoors, climbing, ballroom, and theater. Like many alumni, I'm especially thankful for many of the close connections I made on and off campus, including some familiar faces I see today, or at least in the Zoom participant list. Now, um, today, I live in San Francisco and I work in software sales as an account executive at Census. It's a data management and integration platform. When asked by my family what that means, I tell them we help companies actually remove you from their email list when you click unsubscribe. But the reason why I'm here moderating today is I'm a member of CMC's Alumni Association Board of Directors, where I sit on the Communications Committee and co-chair our DEI committee for diversity, equity, and inclusion. If anyone here is curious in learning what that means, or they're interested in ways to be involved with the Alumni Association, please reach out to me. Always happy to have conversations. It's been an excellent experience and a great opportunity to help grow our Claremont community. Now, before we begin with today's presentation, there are just a few Zoom reminders. For the duration of the presentation, please stay on mute. There'll be time at the very end to thank Professor Fergus for their time. And then also, questions are welcome at any time. If you do have a question, please write it in the chat, or you can send it privately to myself or Rebecca Pelen on Zoom. We will have time for Q&A at the end of the session. Now, Rebecca, is there anything else before we dive in? Okay, perfect. Well, today we are going to be hearing from Dr. Devin Fergus, Professor of History and Public Affairs at CMC, as part of, again, our CMC Connect series. Professor Fergus's research examines the intersection of political economy, public policy, and racial dynamics with respect to shaping opportunity and inequality in today's America. He brings a unique lens to these questions, as seen in his acclaimed book, Land of the Fee, Hidden Costs and the Decline of the American Middle Class. I'm just going to say, I think that's one of the best titled books I've ever heard. Phenomenal. The work reveals how the proliferation of hidden financial fees, such as auto insurance, college payments, and bank transactions, are quietly but surely expanding the wealth gap between the rich and the rest. Professor Fergus has been published in outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Guardian, and his current research examines white-collar crime and the racial wealth gap in order to understand how structural forces shape both individuals and communities. Now, when I was reading about Dr. Fergus and connecting them before the call, what made his work so compelling is his ability to connect historical patterns to contemporary challenges. In part because of his abilities to make such connections, he sits on a number of national boards, including the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, the nation's oldest Black think tank. For today's conversation, we will explore how the public sector is a source of Black economic stability and mobility, but also what happens when it's dismantled. These changes ultimately impact not just Black communities, but all Americans. And so, without further delay, I am thrilled to welcome Professor Devin Fergus for what promises to be a thought-provoking conversation. Devin, the Zoom floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tony. And I want to thank a few other people who've made this moment possible, individuals and groups, again, whose intellectual energy and behind the scenes labor, again, make this afternoon a conversation happen today. Particularly people like Beth Yeager, obviously Tony, the CMC Alumni Association Board of Directors, and particularly the Committee on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, as well as my colleagues in the History Department. And a special single out thank you to Rebecca Pellan, who's been so dedicated and committed to making today's dialogue possible. Your perseverance and your positivity is personally inspiring to me. And I'll sort of say this too. I'm glad that this talk is taking placed before the next event, which I think is going to be on like college athletics, which is always a popular subject that no faculty member ever wants to compete with. So I'm glad I'm presenting today. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint slide. And so, as you can see it from the cover slide, it's Woodrow Wilson kicking out a, a black civil servant um, during the Woodrow Wilson years. So now, each September, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, or known as ASALH, which is the oldest academic organization in the world dedicated to the study of Black life and Black experience. Each year, ASALH selects a theme to guide its national conference and public outreach efforts for the year ahead. This past September, so last September, September 2024, ASALH announced its 2025 theme would be Blacks in Labor. And it's a choice that couldn't be more timely, given the ongoing assault on the public sector, a sphere of employment that has long served as a cornerstone of Black economic security and upward mobility. So ASALH selects this thing, and he selected it prior to the election, but it's a theme which was sort of clairvoyantly sort of selected. Now, for generations, public and publicly funded employment has traditionally offered Black Americans more equitable wages, greater job stability, and clearer pathways to the middle class, and the opportunities that the private sector has historically failed to provide. But that stability is under siege. Now, a few weeks ago, the president took the unprecedented step, or nearly unprecedented step, of firing the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, breaking with a long-standing tradition where sitting chairs typically remain at least through the start of an administration. Now, the significance of this move was amplified by the fact that the outgoing chair, a four-star African-American Air Force general, was dismissed under the claim of being an, quote, unqualified DEI hire. And his replacement was a less experienced, or is a less experienced one who was nominated, is a less experienced three-star general who does not meet the legal standards for the position, and for that reason will require a special waiver to assume the role. This is not an isolated event. Instead, it fits a much longer historical and broader pattern of a systematic purge of civil servants, or these have echoes of the past, of civil servants of color from the federal government. Um, and so today's attack on this vital engine of Black advancement, again, is not without precedent. And so I'm going to talk briefly and trace the history of this Black public sector surge, which occurs in the earlier part of the 20th century, where it comes from, why it matters, and what's at stake. But before we plumb that history, let me briefly walk you through the arc of today's presentation. Let me see if I can. First, I'll explore this sort of forgotten history of the First Great Purge. I'll look over that, spend some time on that. Then, next I'll show why an assault on the Black public sector matters, and the centrality of this public option vis-a-vis other options, others in relation to a Black urban mobility, especially since the 1960s, or since in the second half of the 20th century. And then I'll briefly go back and very briefly return to where we started in sort of current administration, and say a very quick word about the current purge in which we now find ourselves in. So let's look at this history a little bit. Now, before the Wilson administration, Black federal employment in Washington, D.C. was significant, comprising roughly 10% of the federal workforce in 1910. Again, it wasn't always that way. It really is, it ramps up in the latter part of the 19th century, 20th century, in the aftermath of something called the Pendleton Act. And I could talk a bit more about Pendleton and the ways in which that created space for Black employment. But we see that under Wilson, the rate of Black hiring in federal jobs fell sharply, especially in skilled positions. And so we see that the rate of Black hiring drops. And then we also see not simply the rate of Black hiring drops, but those Blacks who are in positions, particularly supervisory roles, during the Wilson years, found themselves either demoted or dismissed from their positions, effectively ending their career trajectories. So Black federal employees, or once a growing middle class in Washington, D.C., would experience job losses and wage reductions. And by the end of Wilson's presidency in 1921, many Black professionals were either forced into lower wage jobs or left government service altogether. Now, civil rights organizations and activists did not take Wilson's policy of segregation of the federal government. They did not take it passively or sitting back. You see, as this letter from the NAACP to Woodrow Wilson in 1913, that they feared what this caste system of hiring, caste system of federal employment would do in terms of jeopardizing Black employment and Black mobility. And it's important to note that the NAACP at this period of time is a nascent organization. It gets founded in 1908, 1909, early, so it's around but less than 5 years at this point. Um, and as we see, the board of NAACP is primarily, exclusively, almost all white. So these are white progressives who are on board, who are speaking out on issues of racial equality and racial justice. The president, Moorfield Story, the famous civil rights attorney. At the very bottom of the letter is Oswald Garrison Villard, the grandson of William Lloyd Garrison. And in between Story and Villard, of course, Du Bois, the director of publicity. And so this is it's a interracial, biracial response to the purging of Blacks in government, and in this case specifically the segregation of Blacks in government. And the situation seemed to be far more worse than even the NAACP had imagined in their initial reaction and response to the Wilson administration in 1913. Let me and so you see here, make sure that during the Wilson years, we see is that Black federal employment drops by nearly 40% during the Wilson years, from roughly 19 sort of almost 19 in terms of almost 10%. It drops to nearly 40% as Blacks are purged from government, and in ways in which really NAACP had not even imagined in the initial response to that for the Wilson policy and program. And what we're going to see is not simply are Blacks purged from government, but as scholars point out, that they also find their wages decline. We'll sort of talk about that a little later. So scholars like Eric Yellen and others have identified that skilled Black clerks and Black clerks and Black workers would find themselves in their employment opportunities decreased by 15%. And the question is, what's driving Wilson's desire to purge Blacks from federal government? And I say Wilson's desire. I mean, if you would talk to Wilson at the time, Wilson would say, "This is not something I want to do, but it's being something that's being foisted or forced upon me by the Postmaster General and Treasury and other federal government agencies." But Wilson is nonetheless really behind this effort to remove Blacks from government. So, what's behind the purge? Well, the argument made by the administration was that removing Blacks from government positions, purging these Blacks, federal employed Blacks, will reduce the friction within federal government. That there was having Blacks working next to whites created dis-ease and unease. And so to be more palatable and tolerant of white workers, we're going to remove these Blacks from office, from the civil service positions. Secondly, what's driving the purge is the purge taps into a racialized trope in language. And what I mean by that is there's a working assumption and logic that any Blacks in office, by definition, means that they got there through corrupt means. And thus, the removal of Blacks and having whites in these positions would mean suggests a more efficient sort of government operation. Yellen points this out, but others do as well. And when I say taps into racist tropes, it taps into tropes that have been out there, a narrative that have been out there for decades throughout the U.S. history, tapping into what's called, let's say, the Dunning School of History about Reconstruction, where you have the argument is you have blacks who are installed in positions and offices in government through the hand of whites, and so this working assumption that to have blacks in political office, excuse me, to have blacks in civil servant positions is almost by definition of a form of corruption. It corrupts the space, and so thus remove them makes the space more efficient. Again, taps into narratives of the Dunning School of Reconstruction that Woodrow Wilson was, as a historian, a political scientist, was not simply was more than familiar with it. Remember that Dunning School of Reconstruction, which taps into Claude Bowers' Tragic Era, which is in Birth of a Nation, the film that Woodrow Wilson shows at the White House, and says that is perhaps apocryphally sort of says, or assumed to have said, that is history written with lightning. And this is this narrative and argument about Reconstruction, about how Reconstruction was basically a way to install blacks who were their version of the DEI, civil servants, into particular positions in government that they wholly did not earn or deserve. This is a long-standing narrative, especially the language of efficiency. The language of efficiency is a language which is used explicitly by within the Wilson administration and is used here in Yellen and citing Wilson's decision to purge blacks. So it's language that's for a historian, it lands a particular kind of way for a historian of this period. Um, So not what we see is that for those blacks who did remain in in their civil service positions or jobs during the Wilson years, they found that their wages uh, basically lagged behind their white counterparts. And so the research economist Guo Shu demonstrates and points out that even when accounting for pre-existing disparities in terms of incomes, Wilson's policies sort of further widen these racial earning gaps. Under Wilson, the earning gaps between similarly situated black and white federal servants increased by almost 20%. And when I say similarly situated black and white federal servants, I mean, Shu's research shows that you have blacks and whites with similar educational backgrounds, similar years of experience in positions, and they remain in these occupations. And by the end of the Wilson administration, those blacks with similar backgrounds, educational experiences, find their incomes lagging 20% more than their white counterparts, even taking into account the pre-existing disparities. So the Wilson purge or segregation purges people from jobs, and those who remain in jobs find themselves in the salaries and earnings lagging, opportunities for advancement lagging as well. Now, the big thing is that it would be one thing if Wilson's policies of and purges and segregation of federal employment had simply been limited to the administration itself, the 8 years of that administration. But history shows that's not what happened. Other administrations kept those policies in place. More broadly, the policies of Wilson were modeled at the state and local levels, modeled in the private sector, and so it becomes institutionalized sort of discrimination modeled after Wilson's policies. Eric Yellen points out in his work, many uh, private companies, if they want government contracts, they opt to mirror the Wilson policy in order to curry favor with the administration and federal government policies. So they mirror this kind of discrimination and opportunity to mirror purges. And we see Des King, the noted Oxford historian, his book Separate and Unequal talks about the ways in which areas like transportation and insurance and even sort of the burgeoning or nascent telecommunication industries also modeled themselves after the Wilson segregationist policies and future segregationist policies, again, in part to curry sort of favor. Tom Segru, the noted NYU historian, shows how Northern companies themselves, even if while they may have rejected sort of de jure segregation, models themselves after the Wilson sort of policies, by color coding occupations, color coding works, which in many ways is a way to depress sort of salaries and incomes for certain kinds of occupations and jobs. Um, and this has a cascading effect on Black upward mobility, a cascading effect on job opportunities, especially for the Black middle class in DC, but also nationally. It was not until Roosevelt administration in the 1930s is there began to be some kind of erosion of this sort of system, a slight pushback against it, but not fully throated until Truman's executive order desegregating the federal workforce in 1948, the same executive order which also desegregated the military in 48, which comes out of that the first of the major three major presidential commissions of the 20th century, that commission that Truman oversees that leads to this to secure our rights, that was published in 48, that obviously that Truman uses that commission in part to desegregate again the federal workforce in the late 40s. But the damage in many ways had been done for the first half of the 20th century. And so now we're going to transition to that second half of the 20th century, where we're going to see a much sort of different story about the ways in which the public option creates a vehicle for Black mobility. And so in this second half of the 20th century, here scholars like Michael Katz talk about the public employment and publicly funded employment as the most powerful vehicle for economic mobility. Michael Katz is an urban policy historian. His wonderful work of Why Don't American Cities Sort of Burn? I've talked about this in some ways in capacity with colleagues like Pamela Chan and Lillian Singh in a report we wrote a few years back, looking at these sort of similar sort of issues, but not thinking in this sort of big and broad sort of context that we're the current moment we sort of live in. So let's do a little bit deeper dive into this sort of subject area. So, so we look at this line graph here. The red line graph is the base case. Anything below that red line you see there on your screen, anything below it, or basically is the numbers of underrepresented Americans in the public sector, in the public workforce. And any of the lines above that that red line indicates populations which are overrepresented in the public workforce in the second half of the 20th century. I'm gonna take a quick sip. So as you guys in part digest this line graph a little bit. And so, I mean, as you see from the line graph, Black women and Black men are overrepresented, well represented in this public option sort of space in the second half of the 20th century. And particularly Black women are twice as likely to be represented in the public sector than their numbers in terms of overall population. And Black men are not too far behind that. Again, both Black women and Black men are overrepresented in terms of their numbers in public option in the public sector. So let's dig a little bit deeper behind the numbers and see in part why a little bit, or look at least income. For Black men, we're going to look at Black men first, and we'll do a deeper dive in Black women. So we see by 1970 that not only are Blacks overrepresented, Black men overrepresented in the public sector, but they're also likely to earn more in public sector work. More in public sector work by 1970 than the private sector work, more in public sector work than, let's say, if they were entrepreneurs. It's a steady, consistent sort of narrative of the 20th century. Here, at the dawn of the new millennium, see Um, black men in the public sector still earning more by the dawn of the new millennium than they would in the private sector, and than they would in as entrepreneurs. In fact, by the dawn of the 21st century, research shows that black men are likely to earn more as entrepreneurs than they would in actually in the private sector. And the story with black women is even more stark. And black women by the dawn of the 21st century and sorry, new millennium are earn twice as much in public sector work than they do in private sector work. And are more likely to actually earn more as entrepreneurs than in if they were engaged in private sector work. There's a wonderful report put out and done by the Federal Reserve of Kansas City about the incredible rise and growth of Black women entrepreneurs. Uh, the downside of that story is, despite the growth and rise of Black women entrepreneurs, the inability to get small business loans, entrepreneurial spirit, but unable to access capital. I mean, that's love to talk more about that and research that a bit more. But we see here again, Black women in the public sector earning twice as much as they do in the private sector. And here, this bar graph, it combines, again, both Black men and Black women. And we see here, Black women, the only sector in which they earn more than Black men is in the public sector, which seems in part kind of consistent. Because you know by the start of the 21st century that Black women are also better educated than Black men. They're more likely to have undergraduate degrees than Black men. So they're more likely to finish school and have degrees. So it seems logical that they earn more than men in that public sector. And we can also perhaps pursue what kind of fields and majors that they major in. But again, they earn more than Black men in the public sector, but not so much in as entrepreneurs or in the private sort of sector. And so the question in part becomes, why is this the case? Why is it that the private sector is less effective than the public one in providing access to employment, in providing better wages? And I've left out this other part too, which is vital, but it's vital. More likely to provide advances through promotion, more likely to have much better benefits as employers in the public sector, more likely to have much better security in terms of the in terms of retirement security in the private sector and the public sector. In all these phases, the public sector outdoes the private sector when it comes to African Americans. And so the question is, why is the private sector lagging behind so much than the public one? The business scholar, Nancy DiTomaso, a professor of management at Rutgers Business School, I mean, presents some reasons why, and I'll go through some reasons why by DiTomaso as well as some others. Let's start with DiTomaso sort of first. So what does DiTomaso sort of argue? What DiTomaso shows is that the private sector is less effective than the public sector for a few reasons. The main one is that the private sector relies heavily upon social networks. So DiTomaso argues it's not the racism and inherent racism of those in the private sector, but nor is it that the private sector is more merit-based. Rather, DiTomaso sort of argues that the private sector relies heavily on informal networks, social capital, and that whites are simply more likely to receive sort of job leads or have people intervene on their behalf, to have personal referrals, informal recommendations, and to have access to inside information that people of color and African Americans specifically do not have. And where do these referrals and personal interventions and recommendations, inside information comes from? DiTomaso sort of lays it out it comes from family and friends and the friends of friends, acquaintances. I mean, those are people how you access that you have. And it leads, DiTomaso argues, to things like opportunity hoarding among communities. Kind of what he calls sort of racial favoritism. So it's not discriminating necessarily against the population, but it becomes a built-in advantage that this population has and seizes and exploits. And so that is so much in such a way that the good jobs stay in sort of these sort of racially homogeneous sort of networks. And she briefly sort of compares this to the public sector, or we can compare it to the public sector, in which the hire is much more structured. Public sector, and again, it's more of a continuum. So it's not that it's a black or white either, or it's just more of a continuum. But in the public sector, um, relies less on these sort of personal networks than these structured hiring processes, less reliant upon, again, personal connections. Um, the public sector typically, traditionally, is more transparent and it's more actually more merit based. I mean, I talked about the Pendleton Act, in which you install literally a civil service exam in the 19th century, which is triggered by the assassination of James Garfield, because someone didn't get a patronage that they anticipated. And so the federal government installs this sort of civil service exam process. So more transparent, more merit based. Uh, and so a more formalized sort of hiring process and promotion process through, as I mentioned before, civil service exams and job postings, and also anti-discrimination sort of policies, which again forces actors to be more transparent and accountable in their behavior. Again, Di Tommaso demonstrates that nearly 7 out of 10 of the white respondents identify that they secured their jobs through personal contacts, not through the formal application process that many Blacks and Latinos tend to do. Um, and this survey is based upon 1,500 respondents, primarily working class and middle class, white interviewees. There are some from the upper class, but more primarily working class and middle class white interviewees, based upon 1,500, again, respondents that she uses. Um, so this is what Di Tommaso argues about how people secure and get their jobs. But once you get your job, the question is, are you able to, is there a conveyance to upward mobility? Is there conveyance with that job? So Di Tommaso lays out the difficulties and barriers one has to even getting employment. um, a report by the management consulting group, McKinsey and Company, uh, identifies the 6 challenges that when Blacks actually do land a job in the private sector, that 6 challenges that they face uh, in maintaining those jobs and then moving up within their occupation or profession. So we're going to briefly look through this. And before I do, as you see, the study is based upon nearly 4 million reports, 4 million employees, 25,000 respondents. And it was done in February 2021. So they talk about these frontline jobs, and they're primarily frontline jobs, is to say this briefly, is basically almost public sort of facing jobs, jobs as cashiers, jobs as receptionists, could be hotel receptionists, but also jobs in housekeeping as well. So more sort of frontline occupation, frontline jobs. That 3 out of 4 frontline workers they want to be promoted, but less than a quarter of them actually achieve it. And that Blacks are overrepresented in terms of the population numbers in these frontline jobs and occupations. And then what McKinsey report yields is that Black employees in these positions fail to connect with sufficient opportunities for advancement. And this is not simply a small percentage of Blacks. Almost half of Blacks are in these sort of 3 industries of healthcare, food services, and retail. And if you want to add a fourth industry to it, accommodations, that number spills to more than half. And so that represents a large number of Black workers again who want promotion and have difficulty sort of finding it. So this is through frontline jobs. Through entry-level positions are a bit more office sort of work, a professional kind of work. But even in these entry-level positions, what's been identified is called the revolving sort of door, where Black entry-level level employees face higher attrition rates than their white counterparts. They feel more alienated at the workplace, less connected to people, and people feel less connected to them, continuing and encouraging them to continue through the workplace. So very short stints at workplaces and for blacks in these professional occupations, low-level professional occupations, these entry-level jobs. And blacks come in, but they don't stay. And companies do seem to do less to try to keep them. So this is again a second major factor. Um, and the third factor, a third challenge that blacks sort of face in these sort of spaces is that they face what's called a broken rung or barrier, moving from entry level positions to managerial positions. And so blacks account for roughly, roughly, are roughly reflective of the general population numbers. 20% of blacks in entry level positions, but almost barely half of those actually move up to managerial positions. And this I think is a particularly stark because if you look at the far end of the spectrum here, blacks are actually more likely to be represented or more likely to be faces on boards uh, than actual in managerial positions. And so boards are public facing spaces. And so for that reason, the optics of wanting to have people of color on boards, but you don't have the similar sort of numbers of blacks in managerial positions. And so we know that blacks are skilled enough to be on boards. But the question is, what happens in that interim stage? What can be done better to matriculate blacks from these entry level positions to jobs? We're going to look at two other factors which tie into these previous three ones that I just identified. So what can be these two other factors that might help in part to explain the failure in terms of front line, the failure in terms of entry, and the failure and the broken rung problem? One, McKinsey report identifies is the lack of trust, the trust deficit that exists at workplaces and companies. Only 23% of Black employees, according to the McKinsey report, receive a lot or quite a bit of support to advance. They receive support from the companies to advance compared to what actually the broader population receives. But similarly, Black employees are 41% less likely than their white counterparts to actually view promotions of colleagues as fair. So there's a lack of trust that exists within companies and corporations. This is why transparency in part is so helpful and so useful, because there exists a lack of trust according to McKinsey's study and McKinsey report. So not simply is there a lack of trust, but but Black employees are more likely than white employees to report that they lack sponsorships and allies within the company or within the corporation that they exist. And so there's not that kind of sustained sort of mentorship. What's noticeable too, in what this McKinsey report sort of lays out, is that companies say they have these sponsors and allies, but both white and Black employees actually say that they don't feel it and they don't sense it. And so, and I think it's important that institutions connect with their employees. And so if the employees don't feel it, then perhaps the other steps could be taken to so their employees might be able to feel that sense of allyship and sponsorship at the workplace. And finally, at the current pace, it will take nearly a century for Black employees to close this occupational and promotional gap. McKinsey report says that there is a silver lining, that if you try to address some of these barriers and challenges, perhaps address the barrier and challenge of sponsors at the workplace, allies at the workplace, how do you work on creating and building greater trust at the workplace? That responding to some of these challenges could help close that employment gap for companies, so the companies don't have experienced so much turnover, and they have a bit greater sense of loyalty and commitment from their employees. Um, Again, reducing the gap for these employees, but also helping the bottom line for businesses and companies and corporations ultimately. So in sum, or re-summarize that you see here, 6 common challenges in the private sector that Blacks face compared to the public sector. Frontline jobs, the as inline as dead end jobs, entry level positions with the revolving door. Again, the broken rung problem, the inability to be able to move up that that professional chain, part because of trust and deficit, and also again because of lack of sponsorship and allyship, and what it means if you don't address these particular issues. So, um, now very briefly, I'm going to talk about the current moment. Um, and I'm a historian, so I'm going to look at the current moment by looking at the past moment, the recent past, which is also the best indicator, often the best indicator of the present and future. Here we see and in the last four administrations, presidential appointments, um, and for people of color within these last four administrations, and we see here that the most recent past administration uh, uh, had overpopulations of blacks in terms of in terms of confirmations, and did again exceptionally well compared to previous administrations for Latinos and Asian Americans as well. The current administration, which was the one previous to the Biden administration, Trump administration, um, again had lower percentages across the board, essentially, basically compared to the other administrations, both Republican and Democrat. So to put the current administration in this sort of broader context of both political parties, which it functions. Yeah. And so this is in the first sort of 300 days of these administrations. And so prior to the election, labor sociologists did some projections looking at what a second Trump administration would look like, how similar it would be to the first. The other one looked at confirmation hearings, confirmation appointments. These are looking at career civil servants, and it offered a projection. And I'll just say this, that this projection was provided in the fall of 2024, prior to the election. And I'm going to have us focus in on the two bookends here, the red bar graph and the purple bar graph of this projection by labor sociologists, looking at projections of what an administration would mean for civil servants, particularly for communities of color, African Americans, which is, again, the primary vehicle for Black urban mobility and Black economic security. We see here that it's projected to have 50,000 layoffs, job losses. But out of that, Blacks are disproportionately represented in that number. And so more than half of the layoffs were projected to have an effect on Black civil servants. Again, this is a projection which happens again before the election, though labor sociologists in the aftermath said that these projections were probably underestimated what the losses would be and the disparate impact would have on Black communities. So according to what's been said and told to me by labor sociologists in recent weeks and recent months. And so to sum up the talk, the public sector has traditionally been the most reliable engine of Black economic mobility in the 20th century. It's one of the truisms, one of the most secure facts that you can actually find in my profession and feel how important the public sector has been to Black mobility. Well, we've also seen that the systematic purges in the early 20th century and job losses threatened Black middle class stability in the past as it does now, and that the decline in the public sector and employment really forces or tracks Blacks into private sector jobs, which pay less, which have fewer benefits, fewer protections, and fewer securities, not simply while they're in that position or occupation, but even afterwards. What we see too is that in these positions where Blacks are often forced to go to, that their retirement package is often much weaker. So the need for expanding fiduciary protections and preserving public sector opportunities are part critical for Black economic security, especially as they move into if they're forced to move into these sort of private sector occupations. That's it. Just a final thank you I'd like to provide, and that's to my wonderful research assistants, Charlotte Jordan and Ella Labarta. You guys been wonderful. You guys are wonderful and great. You can contact me at my CMC, or you can also reach out to me at Gmail as well. Thank you. And I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Fergus. This was a very insightful talk. Love digging into all this data. I would gonna feel like I'm gonna be listening to this recording multiple times after. We did get quite a few questions from folks on the call. And as a reminder, if any of you do have questions, please put them in the chat or message them directly to myself or Rebecca. We are here. Now, Professor Fergus did mention that they have a couple minutes to stay over, so we do not need to end exactly at 5, and we will try to work through as many of these as we can. Now, the first question is actually a very timely one, where just yesterday, Trump released an executive order supporting historically Black colleges and universities, which for this writer was surprising. And it did so. He did cause the removal of the 2020 order or about them, but like, was this net change positive is the question. So I think the question, Professor Fergus, is like, what do you think about this new executive order in support of HBCUs? And would you call it a net change for students and alumni of those organizations in spite of Trump's past actions towards those institutions?
No, excellent question. And again, I've not looked at the executive order, so that's the short answer. I need to look at it more. Need to look at it. It's not a surprise that Trump did so. He did a similar thing in his first administration. Previous Republican presidents have done so, dating at least back to Richard Nixon, frankly, who expanded federal support. And that becomes the fundamental question in many ways, Tony. This is why I need to look at the executive order. Does that executive order, in quote, support, does it come with material financial resources and benefits? So that would be for me, the sort of big sort of question. And I've not looked at the executive order, but it's not unusual. It is fairly common that presidents, particularly Republican presidents, provide funding and support. Black colleges are critical and vital for Black education. Schools like North Carolina A&T University graduate more Black engineers and PhDs than any other school in the country. So they play a vital and critical role. The question becomes, what kind of financial support is given in that executive order? Part of my other research, I'm working on Clinton's initiative on race in the 1990s. Clinton was wonderful for talking about dialogue and talk, but a level of frustration rose with some members of that Clinton commission, because the talk never came with full-throated financial support to address the issues that exist. And that would become in part the question of what comes financially with this executive order. And I have a lot of friends at HBCUs. In fact, I start out by the talk by ASALH, the head of ASALH, one of the heads of ASALH, teaches at Morgan State University. And before that, he was at Howard University. So I have a lot of friends in context HBCUs. Their fundamental question would be, where's the financial support? And that these things are not mutually exclusive, frankly, supporting Black institutions, but also supporting white institutions of higher education, which gets to the net effect, frankly. But I need to look at the executive order. Happy to answer more fully once I look at the executive order, if the person wants to reach out to me. And you can reach out to me here at Gmail or at CMC. Happy to respond more full-throatedly and more accurately once I look at the executive order. And that would be really almost any kind of contemporary kind of issue, frankly.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And absolutely for the person who messaged me about this, please reach out to Professor
Yeah,
Fergus.
absolutely. I welcome it. Thank you.
The following question is also related to recent actions by the federal government, where we're seeing through organizations like Doge of this shrinking of the public sector. If the public sector continues to shrink, what would you say are the broader consequences for American economic stability and racial equity?
Sure. And again, all my answers are qualified that
Mm.
I'm a historian by training. These are fluid answers. Um, I mean, the shrinking of the private of the public sector, shrinking of government, and it doesn't simply affect obviously um, government institutions, but also clearly universities, which are being contracted. Um, and so, um, would it? This is what I would say. In part, it does it. Um, that we've seen in the last couple of decades the growth of the Black middle class and more broadly, people of color within the middle class, frankly, in part because of public sector opportunities. And so, if you end up shrinking the middle class, and particularly people of color within the middle class who are in these publicly funded or public employment spaces, what ends up happening is that you end up shrinking the tax base for that society, which means you end up creating greater risk for infrastructure, which means that you end up creating greater risk for people's retirement benefits and plans and packages down the road. And so the middle class more broadly has always been the vehicle and stabilizer for American democracy, American democratic capitalism, especially, I should say, especially for the 20th sort of century. And when you pull out that thread, and this is a problem too, with as I see it as a historian, um, it would be one thing to shrink the public sector, and then to increase and to have this position on tariffs, while you also lift up manufacturing industry by supporting labor unions, which provide a baseline of income and wages, right? Which has been so critical for the creation and stabilization of the white middle class in the 20th century. But to shrink the private sector, to to impose tariffs without on the same side also providing a bulwark for unionization and labor, that really does put the middle class in a very precarious situation in the 21st century. I mean, I can go back to the Woodrow Wilson sort of story, um, where where issues of tariffs and income taxes and monopolies are a critical and vital issue, which people say that Wilson rode that wave in part to the White House compared to his competitors, especially Theodore Roosevelt and others, and Taft. So, but you can't shrink if you shrink the private sector. It jeopardizes the middle class more broadly, especially if you don't in the excuse me, public sector. Excuse me, you shrink the middle class more broadly, especially if you don't provide effective bulwarks and undergirdings like support for labor organization in the private sector. At least that's been the history of much of the 20th century that I'm using on, and I fall back to Oliver Wendell Holmes that a page of history is worth a volume of logic, and the history of the 20th century has been stabilized middle class through the creation of labor unions, and for Black Americans, the creation of the public sector as that kind of stalwart and security. And when you shrink that, you jeopardize their middle class, and you jeopardize the future of all Americans who rely upon the middle class for infrastructure and retirement packages, retirement security, frankly. So,
I think that's a really interesting take on. I have my notes down here, and you put this point about the greater risk to the middle class as stabilizers of American democracy and this global status. I think that's a headline of a future talk of itself.
No, absolutely. And that's the greater concern, especially we know that the middle class demographically is changing. Um, but that same, and this is my first book kind of addresses this. So you talk about White Collar Crime Project, it certainly addresses this. But we know that the changing demographics of that middle class is also the same population which has been historically targeted. And so if you continue to extract wealth and resources from that middle class, which is growing, um, then you end up really threatening the whole edifice of the economic system, frankly. And that's in kind of what's been happening um, in recent years and recent decades, in many ways under both administrations, both parties, not just one, but especially more so one than the other, but both ones nonetheless.
No, thank you for answering that. This was another question. We have a few, and then I know I feel like we have too many questions to be able to get through. So if those are that we can't reach, please reach out
No, absolutely.
with questions. This is related to when you're talking about you said overrepresentation in the public sector. You know, why would, typically why would Black women be even more represented than Black men in the public sector? And then what would their presence being quote unquote overrepresented have on shaping these public institutions? I think for me, like when I was following your point on the challenges of people in the workforce where there's this lack of sponsorship or lack of moving beyond the front line, there might be a limitation on the actual influence that these individuals can have despite their larger share.
That's a great point. Now I need to dig a little more into it. Absolutely great point. I would also love to dig more into this to complicate this picture, bring in other communities of color. I would love to kind of have that be able to do that kind of research. But getting back to Black women, their um, their access to public employment um, uh, is well. They're Can you restate the question? I think I got it, but restate it one more time.
Yeah. The question is actually, why are Black women even more represented than Black men in the public sector? And what has their presence had on shaping public institutions?
Sure. Okay. More represented than men, and the short answer is I don't know the full answer to that question. This is my this is my hypothesis or working answer to that response. They're more greatly represented in the public sector, and oh boy, there's so much research in terms of earlier parts of history, but they're overrepresented in this public sector because of lack of adequate opportunities in the private sector. So just I they're more likely to have college degrees. I was my mother was a Black woman. I was gonna say I raised my Black woman. My mother, both my parents raised me. My response is Black women are rational actors, and I put up the chart there where Black women are making twice as much in the public sector than they are in the private sector, and so logic would dictate that if I'm making twice as much in the public job than I can in a private one, I'm going to take the public job. Black men are making more I'm making more in the public sector than in the private sector, but not twice as much. And so there's less of an incentive. And there's a lot of research in the early part of the 20th century, economic research about the way economic segregation sort of works, and how industries and markets get created because of segregation and Jim Crow. And this is in many ways a kind of implicit sort of outgrowth of that. So just that the money is better in the public sector, opportunities for advancement for women are better, and so it corresponds too with their being better educated. So they're in a marketplace which is responding to the merit of the applicant. We're better educated than the other applicants, frankly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we might have time for one or two more questions. This next question is related to the previous one where you just answered talking about the expansion of private sector, but this person asked for expansion, for you to expand on the corporate sector being this new vehicle for lower socioeconomic, Black or mixed undergrads. Um, you know,
Mm.
my previous job, where I was at Handshake for 5 years, we saw a lot of data on employment rates, on income rates for students, and typically it seems like private sector has that big draw because there might be bigger opportunities or for financial stability post graduation. But you also talk about the high turnover and where that might come in. So, you know, I think there's this point on expansion on this corporate sector being the new vehicle for mobility for lower income Black and mixed undergraduates, but then also, you know, what is the process to allow people to build wealth even when accounting for that higher turnover?
So if I understand the last question, the process to build wealth if they pursue private sector employment, is that what you're saying? Or
Yeah, I think that this writer is asking about, we see private sector as this vehicle to building wealth in the United
Mhm.
States
Okay.
today. But that doesn't necessarily match up with the data that you've shared with us.
Mhm. Sure. No, and so I mean, certainly for those entering into the workforce, the private sector might be more attractive, more lucrative, if you have a, a degree, a college degree, things like that. I'd sort of say, and a person of color. Um, but it doesn't necessarily mean it has that kind of security and stability down the road. Um, and as you get older, you might want more interested in in the security of down the road. Um, uh, this is in some ways directly connected to the student loan kind of question. I think you referenced I did some student loan research in my work, right? So people of color, African Americans particularly, come out of college owing more student loans, and so you might want to pursue the private sector work to help pay off student loans. I mean, there was a student loan forgiveness program. I'm not sure the status of that at this point, but so you might want to go in the private sector to help pay off student loans. But what we also know is that uh, that the private sector has much more volatility in terms of employment. So you're more likely to get sort of laid off, lose your position, lose your job, in ways in which in the public sector you're less likely to lose. And again, in the longer term analysis and longitudinal analysis, you're more likely to be able to advance professionally, promotionally in the public sector than in the private sector. So while at least initially the private sector might be more attractive and more lucrative, um, down the road, you get greater security in that sort of public sector. And also, the research out there shows that um, in terms of retirement securities, fiduciary sort of issues in terms of retirement, um, that that the weakest fiduciary protections are typically found in industries where you have the most blacks. And so while this gets to short-term interest versus long-term advantage and security. So on the short run, you might be able to make more money. For long-term security and protections, the public sector still might be better off in terms of things like retirement securities and protections, frankly.
Yeah, that's an interesting point on there. Okay, for the last question before we sign off is just related for what you would recommend, what resources you'd recommend the folks on this call to check out if they're interested in learning more about this topic.
Wow. Okay. I mean, I feel like I need to put together a read list to send it out.
Yeah, make a syllabus for us.
Exactly. Oh, I mean, yeah, you and I talked before about Kevin Whitson's Black Ceiling as one important work. I mean, I'd recommend one work that fundamentally changed how I view the world. Um, was Tom Shapiro's The Hidden Cost of Being African American. I think is a vital and critical work. So Black Ceiling by Kevin Winston, Tom Shapiro's Hidden Cost of Being African American. Um, and I mean just the works I share here, D. Tomas's work, The American Non-Dilemma, the McKinsey's report again is a managing consulting company which consulting firm which again is which is very important to it to address issues of the private sector, and how do you have greater profitability and greater stability and growth in the private sector. So the McKinsey report, I think I'd recommend that as well. Shameless plug for my own book, Land of the Fee. And so and I'm also putting together some research now about really white collar crime and the impact it has on the racial wealth gap, and what that means in the broader sense for the future of American democracy. Again, we know that the next American middle class is going to be look very different from the current and the previous ones, and what that all means for us here today and in the future. So those are some of the things I would suggest.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much for providing this. Rebecca, I don't know if we have a distribution list of the people after this call, but if we can provide them with that book list, I think that would be an excellent action item.
Absolutely, yeah, would love to. Absolutely.
Yes, we do. I can definitely send that to everyone. Mhm.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, we are over for time. I just want to say thank you to you, Professor Fergus, for joining us today. Thank you, Rebecca, for helping put together today's session, and for all of you, alumni and friends of Claremont, for tuning in. You know, speaking as someone who is in the industry today that deals with a lot of this, it's great to always have people that we can talk to have allies, to be able to open up these conversations. So please continue to put in the good work.